Hello, I'm David Leitner, and welcome to part 3 of our series on Canon's Cinema EOS family of cameras. In this part, we're going to look at 4K and 2K and HD capture and recording using the C500 and the 1D C. Now, the C500, Canon designed to be the highest performance 2K and HD digital cinema camera available today. It favors both television and cinema production. For instance, it gives you a choice of HD for television, that would be 1920 by 1080, and a choice of 2K for cinema, that would be 2048 by 1080. It also gives you a choice of Ultra HD for future television, that would be 3840 by 2160, or 4K for cinema production, 4096 by 2160. It covers all the bases. It favors the future of television in another way. Its output of 4K and Ultra HD is via dual 3G SDI terminals, which transmit uncompressed 2K and 4K over standardized, not proprietary, but standardized 3G SDI terminals. The C500 is the only 4K camera using standardized 3G SDI for this purpose. At present, to record 2K and 4K, however, the C500 requires capture to a third-party recorder, which we'll talk a little bit about in a later section. Now let's revisit Canon's 16:9 Super 35 CMOS 4K image sensor. It offers 8.85 million photosites. That's 4096 by 2160 when shooting 4K. For Ultra HD, it offers 8.29 million photosites. That's 3840 by 2160. That's 4 times the pixels of HD, which is why Ultra HD is sometimes called Quad Full HD or Quad HD. Now, what about HD? Well, the C500, because it has 4 times the pixels of HD when it's shooting Ultra HD, for HD, it can supply 4 of its photosites to create each HD pixel. That means that each HD pixel contains 2 green, 1 red, and 1 blue photosites. As a result, there's no debayer process. There's no debayering step in post. There's no color detail interpolation when shooting HD. There are no reconstruction errors during the debayering process. 2 green photosites per pixel equals what Canon calls Supergreen. It creates a luma signal with a very high modulation transfer called MTF that translates into sharpness with 0 aliasing in the all-important green channel. So what does all of that add up to? It adds up to an HD signal that's uncompressed, 12-bit, RGB, 444 with no color subsampling. You get full color space. There's no compression noise, no debayering, as I mentioned, and a high MTF from Supergreen with a 12-stop latitude using Canon log. And that creates the finest possible HD image. So you might ask, if the HD is so good from the Canon C500, why bother to shoot 4K? Well, if you've seen 4K on the big screen, you know that the images are absolutely breathtaking, and that may be reason enough. But also, from a business standpoint, if you shoot in 4K, you have what are called 4K digital masters, sometimes called digital negatives, and that future-proofs your production. That means you may show the finished product in HD today, but in the future, when that production is perhaps repurposed, it can be remastered in 4K, which will retain greater value going forward. Also, 4K images are more easily manipulated because they have greater detail. They're more easily enlarged, reframed. There's little quality loss, especially if the delivery format is HD. What are the HD shooting modes that the C500 offers? Well, internal recording to compact flash cards. It has the same codecs that the C300 has in that regard. That's a suite of MPEG-2 long GOP codecs. For external recording, well, external recording would be 2K, 4K, uncompressed HD. Uncompressed HD, 1920 by 1080, the C500 offers RGB 444 at either 10-bit or 12 bits. frame rates of 2398, 24, 25, 2997, 50, and 59.94, the whole gamut. It also can output uncompressed YCC component 422 at 10-bit, and at frame rates of 50, 59.94, and 120 frames for high-speed work. In 2K, be 2048 by 1080, it's much the same. Uncompressed RGB 444 at 10 or 12 bits, frame rates of 2398, 24, 25, and 2997. Or you'll be shooting YCC 422 uncompressed at 10 bits, frame rates of 50, 59, 94, and 120. What about 4K? Well, 4K would be raw output. 4K would be 4096 by 2160 or 3840 by 2160. Raw at 10 bits, frame rates of 2398, 24, 25, 2997, 50, and 5994. Also, half raw. What is half raw? Half raw is 4096 by 1080. That's HD vertical resolution, or 3840 by 1080. Now, why would you want to cut the vertical resolution in half? Well, half raw allows you to achieve higher frame rates. You can record 50, 5994, which is essentially 60, or 120 frames per second in half raw. Of course, you'll have to reconstruct the lost vertical resolution in post, but it gets you 120 frames per second in 4K with full lateral full K resolution. You might find it interesting to know that the C500's 4K raw signal originates as 4 separate 2K components: red, green 1, let's say green 2, and blue, multiplexed to a single serial digital output according to the latest SMPTE SDI standard, which would be 3G SDI, which we've been discussing. Now, 3G SDI offers double the bit rate of HD SDI. That's why it was created. It was designed to replace dual-link HD SDI. So instead of 2 cables, you could use 1 cable. If you do the math here, that's why it takes 2 3G SDI links to transport all 4 of the C500's separate 2K components. This is pretty much cutting-edge stuff. Now, the 4K RAW is captured as .rmf file stacks. Now, you probably haven't seen .rmf before. It stands for Raw Media Format. And it amounts to about 12 megabytes per frame. At 24 frames per second, that amounts to 16 gigabytes per minute, or nearly 1 terabyte per hour. That's a lot of recording storage on location, and we're going to talk about external recorders in the next segment. The C500 can record also proxy files for editing. 1 terabyte per hour, very difficult to edit even on the fastest computers. Certainly not on many of the computers that we work with day in and day out. But we can, of course, edit HD. So if we can record simultaneous HD proxy files for offline editing of 4K, we have the best of both worlds. And that's what the C500 makes possible. It records the same MPEG-2 files as the C300 does to compact flash cards. That's 1920 by 1080, and it's down-converted simultaneously using the built-in 50 megabits per second 422 8-bit MPEG-2 codec. Again, the same that the C300 uses. Now, when you're shooting, instead of Ultra HD, if you're shooting instead the Cinema 4096 by 2160, the slightly wider aspect ratio format with I think it's 1.896 to 1, the HD proxy is slightly squeezed horizontally when it's down converted. So if you see that, don't be alarmed, that's normal. Video sources on the C500, in addition to the internal recording, allow other ways of recording proxies. And these are external outputs on the C500. They include the HD SDI, which can output an HD signal, 10-bit, 422 HD, or, as I explained earlier, down-converted SD. The Monitor 1 and Monitor 2 terminals can double as HD SDI terminals, and they can provide additional YCC 422 10-bit HD or 2K with embedded audio, timecode, user bits, everything. So that can be used to output proxies if you want to record externally. HDMI can also be used. That's uncompressed. You can also superimpose some of the on-screen display onto the HDMI. Like the C300, some special recording modes in the C500 for recording off speed. For instance, pre-recording, that's where you have a 3-second cache, and the C500 captures 3 seconds in a loop until you press the record button, and it then records everything, those 3 seconds and everything past that point. That only works with HD and MXF files. It doesn't work with 2K or 4K. Frame recording mode for stop motion, that works with 2K and 4K as well as HD, MXF files. However, when you shoot in 2K and 4K in frame recording mode, you can't capture proxy files, so you can't capture HD proxy files. That holds as well for interval recording, which is available in 2K, 4K, or HD with the C500. That's for time-lapse. But again, HD proxy files are not available when you're shooting 2K or 4K. Slow and fast motion, well, in 2K and 4K modes, again, HD is not available. So when you shoot slow and fast motion, you can shoot that in HD, 2K, or 4K, but you can't create proxy files. Now, in the 4K, 2K mode for slow and fast motion, you can shoot RAW, RGB 444 12-bit, or RGB 444 10-bit from 1 to 30 seconds, 30 frames per second, in 1 frame per second increments. Or you can choose 32 to 60 frames per second in 2 frame per second increments. If you choose the 32 to 60 frame rates, you have to use dual 3G SDI terminals. It requires both terminals. If you choose to shoot half RAW, and that's the format that's 4096 by 1080, it has half of the vertical resolution, you'll be shooting YCC 422 component 1 to 60 frames per second in 1 frame per second increments, or 62 to 120 frames per second in 2 frame per second increments. And that requires the use of both 3G SDI terminals because of the data rate. Now, recording these higher frame rates is dependent on the capabilities of the external recorder that you use. Not all external third-party recorders can capture those higher frame rates. If you're confused by all of these different frame rates and all of these different settings, you're not alone. In the 4K or 2K mode, in the C500, there are no less than 44 different combinations of settings, including recording mode settings, RAW, half RAW, RGB 444, 12-bit or 10-bit or YCC 10-bit. There's also system frequency choices. You know, are you shooting 59.94 hertz or 50 hertz or 24 hertz? There are resolution choices. Are you shooting 1920 by 1080 or 4096 by 2160? And there are frame rate choices, 2398 or 5994 or anything in between. So 44 different combinations. It's quite a matrix of choice. If you're choosing to shoot only MPEG-2 HD, slow and fast, the C500 gives you 1 to 30 frames per second in 1 frame per second increments, or 1 to 60 frames per second if you wish to shoot 1280 by 720, and again, 1 frame per second increments. In the MXF mode, which is HD, there are 27 combinations of system frequency, resolution, frame rate, and bit rate. It all depends upon how you look at it. That may be very confusing, but if you think about it, it's giving you virtually every choice you could possibly want. Now, for remote control of the C500, again, you can use a cheap stereo mini phone extension cable. You can pull the hand grip off the C300 and then just extend the hand grip with that cable so that all of the hand grip control is available. With the C500, there's no place for the hand grip to be mounted because in place of the hand grip are additional processing boards which require ventilation, by the way. In fact, if you don't remove this cover, open and remove this cover from the side of the C500, which exposes the 3G SDI terminals, this little fan can't breathe, and the camera won't even start up. But my point is there's no place to attach a hand grip. There is, however, a jack for hand grip control. If you could extend your cable, your $5 cable, and attach it to the hand grip from this point, remote control is possible. But that brings up the question, well, what about if I want to use a hand grip handheld with this camera? So luckily, Zacuto has come up with a wonderful solution. They've actually built a connector that connects to the Canon hand grip and allows the Canon hand grip via a 4-conductor cable to be attached to the C500. As you can see, the Zacuto adapter for the C300 and C500's hand grip works beautifully. We've got it on a pair of rods here, and it allows the C500 to be handheld using the hand grip, and it's the only way I know of at the moment to do that. Now, there's a second way to control the C500 remotely, and that's wirelessly. As in the case of the C300, the C500 can be remotely controlled using an optional WFT-E6 wireless file transmitter. That's a mouthful, but really it's just a little dongle that attaches to a dedicated port here on the C500. And once it's attached, and of course you have to have a Wi-Fi network in the vicinity, once it's attached, the C500 receives an IP address automatically. You enter that IP address as a URL in any browser, an iPad for instance, or a laptop, and it fetches Canon's Wi-Fi remote screen. And that gives you remote control via Wi-Fi of shutter speed, ISO, gain, and it gives you a rudimentary monitoring of the image as well. It's not full frame rate, but you have a strong sense of what the camera is seeing. Now, as with the C300, larger, heavier lenses require either a tripod or a shoulder rig of some sort, usually including a base plate with rods in front and in back for lens support and support of peripherals, in this case, a Codex 4K recorder. Now, this is a C500 with an EF mount. This is a Canon Cinema Zoom 14.5 to 60 with the Codex added in the back. And you can see how well balanced it is. This rig is a Vocus rig, V-O-C-A-S, and it's strong and light. It's so well balanced, in fact, that I can hold the camera with one hand, which is how I judge balance in a handheld rig. Now, again, on the back, I've got a 4K Codex S recorder. It uses a small SSD to capture, solid-state drive to capture 4K RAW, and we'll talk about that in the upcoming section on workflows. The 1D C is a very different beast. It's not a video camera like the C500. It lacks zeros, it doesn't have any peaking, and it's able to window. It has a larger sensor, as we've described earlier. It's a full-frame sensor out of which we can shoot 3 different sizes. We can use the full frame to generate HD. We can use a smaller, slightly smaller window to generate 4K, where 1 photo site equals 1 pixel of 4K, and then an even smaller window to generate HD using Super 35 lenses. Now, my friend Adam Wiltz recently done a series of tests where he found the Super 35 crop to be remarkably free of the visible aliasing. And if you'll remember, when DSLRs first began to be used for HD capture, aliasing was a big problem. The 1D C seems to have discovered a solution to that because there's virtually none. 4K recording requires a really, really fast compact flash card. It requires a UDMA 7 compliant card, which records at least, or it has to record at least 100 megabytes per second or even faster. That's for capturing 4K. If you are only interested in shooting HD with this camera, it's okay to use a less expensive and slower card. You can use a UDMA 5 compliant card, say 60 megabytes per second. That's pretty sufficient for HD. That'll capture pretty much every other format this camera is capable of. Now, when using Canon log with the 1D C, what you need to know is that shooting mode is automatically set to manual. Autofocus becomes unavailable. Auto ISO is unavailable as well when you're using Canon log. What is available is View Assist, and that's the feature where the display of the live view looks normal, even though you're shooting Canon log. It has its contrast resurrected so that you're not fooled by looking at the darkish, flat Canon log image and then making, say, an exposure change, which would be unfortunate. So, View Assist on the back, and you can get a kind of preview of how the Canon log image is going to look. Now, the 1D C's shooting modes include 4K, of course. That's the motion JPEG at 500 megabits per second that's recorded internally to a UDMA 7 compact flash card. That's 4096 by 2160. It's 8-bit 422 at 24p. The 24p, I should add, is actually 23.98. And audio-wise, it's recording, when you shoot 4K, uncompressed linear PCM audio, 16-bit, 48 kilohertz. Now, if you choose to shoot HD using either the full frame portion of the sensor or the Super 35 crop, 1920 by 1080 is recorded as H.264, 8-bit 420 at 24p, 25p, and 30p. But you have a choice in shooting H.264. You can shoot all iframe, all intraframe, or you can choose long GOP. The difference is when you're recording all iframe, every frame is individually compressed, but that takes more bit rate. So the bit rate for shooting all iframe is 90 megabits per second. The bit rate for shooting long GOP H.264 is 30 megabits per second when you're shooting full frame, and it's 50 megabits per second when you're shooting the Super 35 crop. But either way, you're getting almost 3 times, if not 3 times as much recording time on the CF card when you shoot long GOP. Now, if you want to shoot at a faster frame rate, you can shoot all iframes up to 50 and 60p. That would be 8-bit 420, again, all iframe, but the data rate is much higher. That's 180 megabits per second, and that's available from the full frame portion of the sensor. You can shoot as well 1280 by 720 with the 1D C, and that's an 8-bit 420 at 50p or 60p, again H.264. All iframes will require 80 megabits per second, full frame, and long GOP will require 27 megabits per second, and that's full frame as well. For SD, SD is also H.264. It's a 640 by 480 frame, 8-bit 420 at 25p or 30p. You can shoot a long GOP version at only 10 megabits per second, and that's from the full frame portion of the sensor. Now, the container file format is not the MXF that the other Cinema EOS cameras use. Instead, it's .mov, which you'll recognize as QuickTime, which is easily opened in virtually any NLE. Now, let me give you some real-world storage examples. A 16-bit compact flash card holds about 1 hour of HD from the full frame when you're shooting long GOP, and that's at 30 megabits per second. A 16 gigabyte card holds 20 minutes of HD, only 20 minutes, a third of the amount when you're shooting long GOP, when you're shooting full frame, all iframe. And again, that's at 90 megabits per second. At nearly 4 gigabytes per minute, 4K, if you're shooting with a 16 gigabyte compact flash card, it can hold 4 minutes of 4K. It's probably better to use a 64 gig card when you're shooting 4K because that will at least allow you to shoot 16 minutes. Now, you can create proxy files for offline editing of 4K, just like you can with the other Cinema EOS cameras, but you have to record them externally. You can capture clean, uncompressed 8-bit 422 HD with timecode via the mini on the side of the 1D C, and it's available while you're recording 4K to a compact flash card. The signal out of the mini HDMI port, it's also useful for an additional monitor. Maybe a focus puller needs a monitor. There's an additional video source too, analog NTSC. You can output from the audio video out port, which is a mini USB port on the side of the camera. As far as special recording modes, there are no special recording modes in the 1D C. However, you can do interval recording, you can do time-lapse, but it requires an optional remote controller. Canon makes one, it's called a TC80N3, and you can buy that at B&H. This is my Velo. It's a cheaper version of the same thing, and it does exactly the same thing. I just did a time-lapse in China with this using a 7D, which illustrates the fact that this kind of remote timer can work with any of the Canon DSLRs, including the 1D C. Now, stop motion and animation are possible in a similar way using an optional Canon remote switch. It's called an RS80N3, and it also fits all of the Canon DSLRs up to and including the 1D C. There's EOS Utility Software that can be downloaded free from Canon's website for the Mac or PC, which can control various camera settings, including start, stop, and if you're using an EF lens, the lens settings too. And that works via a wired Ethernet connection. You just string an Ethernet cable between your 1D C and your laptop, and a window pops up on your laptop and you're in business. And it's very interesting how that works. You get a kind of rudimentary image as well displayed on the laptop. So that's one way to control the 1D C remotely. And by the way, that works with all of Canon's high-end DSLRs. It's not specific to the 1D C, but it's a very useful thing to know about. Now the 1D C, like the C500, can be operated remotely via Wi-Fi, again using that dongle that I mentioned, the WFT E6 wireless file transmitter. And the 1D C, like the C500, has a dedicated port. You pop that dongle in, and if you're in the presence of a Wi-Fi network, the 1D C receives an IP address. You enter that IP address into any browser. An iPad is a very convenient way to do this, and it fetches Canon's Wi-Fi remote screen, and you can control remotely the focus, the shutter speed, ISO gain, etc. And you again get a rudimentary monitoring of the image. Now to check focus on the 1D C, there's a magnify button. It's located below the LCD panel. It's got a little magnifying glass icon on it, and when you press that once, you get a 5 times enlargement of the LCD image. If you press it twice, you get 10 times magnification of the LCD image in live view, and that's a great way to confirm focus. If you then move the joystick on the back of the 1D C, you can move your magnification window around, and you can look at different parts of the image and know exactly what's in focus and exactly what's not in focus. Now the magnify function is not available during recording. It's only available when you're setting up your shot and before you press the record button, but it's a great way to set up focus and have utter confidence that you're entirely in focus where you want to be in focus before you shoot. Now in terms of ergonomics, the 1D C has the same ergonomics as the Canon EOS 5D Mark II, which has been around for 5 years, the Mark III. There's really nothing new to be said about that. Zacuto makes many rigs. They're available at B&H. Many other companies make rigs for DSLRs. I'll leave that to your imagination. I'm sure you even own these rigs already. Now, our next segment is going to be about Canon Cinema EOS workflows, particularly 4K, and we're going to look at the recorders, the third-party recorders that are necessary to do that. There are several on the market. They're mostly new. We're going to show you a few things you probably haven't seen before, so stay tuned. Join us for the next section.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.